Hi, this is Dr. Gwen Fisher in Psychology 440, Industrial Psychology. We're talking about job analysis, and this is the last and final module in the job analysis segment. Here I will talk about job evaluation and comparable worth. We finally get to talk about money. The agenda for this module is first, I will talk about job evaluation and define what a job's worth, talk about internal and external job evaluation, and then move on to discuss wage discrimination and comparable worth. What are they and what's the difference? There are 3 learning objectives for Module 3.7. By the end of this module, you should be able to explain what job evaluation is, you should be able to explain what comparable worth is, and you should be able to identify the difference between job evaluation and job analysis. Job evaluation is a process by which we take information from job analysis and we turn it into compensation decisions. To be very clear, job analysis and job evaluation are 2 issues that are certainly important for HR professionals in any organization. It's really easy to get these concepts confused and treat them as the same thing. But in fact, they pertain to totally different aspects of a job and enable us to know not only different roles and responsibilities associated with the job, but also what a job is worth in comparison to other jobs in an organization. We can also look at the value or the worth of jobs within one particular organization, in other words, internally, as well as compare the worth of a job relative to others in other organizations. So in other words, for a similar job, what is it paid in one organization compared to another? The goal of job evaluation is to set salary levels in a fair and systematic way, of course taking into account economic constraints or what's reasonable. One of the most common approaches to job evaluation, especially for internal evaluation, is a point system. A point system focuses on what are called compensable factors. Compensable factors are what are the specific parts of a job that would impact the amount of money that or the wages that that job would be worth. For example, how much effort is needed on the job? What are the skills that are needed? What is the level of responsibility? What education, training, or other experience is required? And then what are the working conditions? The pluses and minuses here relate to factors that are likely to impact whether the job is worth more or worth less. It's very important that you understand that compensable factors describe jobs, not the people or the individuals that are posted or assigned to those jobs. So the whole point of using job analysis for job evaluation is so that we could focus on the type of work and the characteristics of the job and determine what the job is worth, not what a person is worth. There are many steps to developing a point system as part of the job evaluation process. The first is to identify what are the compensable factors that should determine what the job is valued at. Then determine the possible levels of each factor. Points are assigned depending on the degree to which the factor is present. Is it a skilled job? Is it a highly skilled job? What is the skill level, and to what extent would that be assigned different points? The next step after determining the compensable factors and the possible levels of each factor is to decide on the weights for each factor. How important is that factor? It might be important that you require a certain degree, but that might not be as important as the level of effort or particular skills that are needed on the job. Once you know the compensable factors, the points assigned for the possible levels of each factor, and the weights for each factor, then add up all the points for each job, and then compare the compensable points to current wages. Here is a graph to show wage equity. Remember in Module 2 when Dr. Gibbons reviewed correlation and regression? And recall that statistics is a prerequisite for this course? Well, here's an example of why. This is a graph showing a regression line. On the x-axis on the bottom is the point value associated with a particular job based on what I just explained on the prior slide of identifying compensable factors and different levels of those factors and assigning points for a particular job. On the y-axis on the left are current wages. These data can be gathered from a number of sources or public databases. In fact, the Occupational Information Network, ONET, even has information about wages at this point available. And what this does is it shows the relationship, the linear relation between the point value assigned to jobs and current wages. Any jobs that fall underneath the line, below the line, would be flagged as being underpaid. Any jobs that are above the regression line are considered overpaid. What we would like to find ideally is a point exactly on the line, which you can see shown here as perfect wage equity, where the point value is directly related to current wages. Any point directly on the line will be at that perfect wage equity. Now I'm going to talk about external pay equity. External pay equity is separate from looking within an organization at what is going on with regard to pay for certain jobs. External pay equity is based primarily on the labor market. From a basic economic standpoint, we can look at supply and demand curves. Simply, when there are a lot of workers available and few jobs, that results in lower wages. In other words, lots and lots of people are competing for very few jobs, therefore organizations don't necessarily need to pay a lot in order to get people to take those jobs. On some level, this might be described as what's going on in Colorado right now. It's a wonderful place to be. Lots of people are flocking to the state. Although there are jobs, there aren't as many relative to the labor supply. And therefore, even though the cost of living is rising incredibly, especially the cost of housing in Fort Collins and Denver and so forth, companies still don't need to pay higher levels of wages simply because there's a large labor supply. On the demand side of the equation, what we see are higher wages that are paid when we have few workers competing for many jobs. In other words, when there are lots and lots of jobs available, those few workers might be desired, and companies are going to be competing for those workers and therefore willing to pay higher wages in order to get the best people as part of the talent acquisition process. So this competition comes about. Again, higher wages come about when there are more applicants and there's a need for better selection. Also, competition means better retention for companies and less turnover. A salary survey is a method by which we can ask how much everybody else is paying. We're very pleased that the Society for IO Psychology does a salary survey approximately every 5 years or so as a way to see across organizations how much are IO psychologists being paid. I encourage you to check out the SIOP website at www.siop.org. And on the site, you can search for salary survey and get some important information. To be honest, I was very fortunate to be able to use this information to negotiate a raise in my prior job to demonstrate what my skills and abilities and so forth are worth as an IO psychologist and what other companies are paying for these jobs. It was very beneficial, especially because I was in a job where I wasn't doing typical IO psychology work at the time. And as you may know, the market value for people in industrial organizational psychology might be high relative to a few other areas. So a salary is a measure of direct compensation. However, there are lots of other kinds of compensation that might be relevant or important, such as, is there employer-provided health insurance? How much vacation time do you get? Do you have opportunities for flexible hours or the opportunity to work from home? Many workers might be willing to take a lower salary in exchange for some of these other factors. For example, would you be willing to take a lower paid job if it meant having more vacation time or more flexibility in your schedule? I certainly would. An important issue is to take into account wage equity in relation to race and gender. It's flat out illegal to pay people differently simply on the basis of their race or gender. Wage discrimination comes about if there's different pay for people who are performing the same job duties. I'm sure you've heard about the statistics that women earn on average, say, approximately 70 cents on the dollar compared to men. While there, in some cases, is some evidence that there is gender discrimination with regard to jobs, it's not fair to just look across all jobs and make a blanket statement about women's pay versus men's pay without taking into account what are the job duties. This is where IO psychologists come into play. The concept of comparable worth is critically important. The gist is that similar work should earn similar pay. Comparable worth is often concerned with fairness in gendered type jobs. In other words, it's the notion that people who are performing jobs of comparable worth to the organization should also receive comparable pay. The Equal Pay Act was passed in 1963 and indicates that equal pay should be paid for equal work. Jobs who are mostly filled by men often pay higher wages than comparable worth compared to jobs filled by women. So there is some empirical evidence, in fact, that there can be gender discrimination or a lack of comparable worth. So I want to be clear about that. For example, if we compare janitors to maids or housekeepers, in many regards, we can say that those jobs are quite comparable. And here, according to these statistics, you can see that there are differences between what janitors are paid, who happen to be 74% male in that job classification, whereas maids and housekeepers are 85% female and earn less. So there's been some argument that there is bias against women's work. This issue can be avoided if what we do is make compensation decisions based on a good job analysis. In other words, it's critical that we evaluate what are the behaviors, skills, etc. that are needed in the job, and then we pay accordingly. That way we can make compensation decisions that are not done on the basis of gender or any other characteristic other than the knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics required for the job. The same issue pertains for minority groups, whether we're talking about race or ethnicity. So how do you tell if the pay differences between jobs mean that there's any kind of bias or discrimination? Well, here's where those statistics come into play again. You begin with a simple test. On average, are majority employees paid more than minority employees? Sometimes pay differences can be explained by real differences in merit. In other words, it could be that some have more experience, generally more work-related experience relevant to the job, perhaps more tenure or experience in the organization in particular, or higher levels of education. Then conduct a hierarchical regression analysis. As you hopefully know at this point, regression is a statistical tool in which we examine the linear relationship among variables, and look to see if one variable can be predicted from another. What hierarchical regression lets us do is statistically control for some variables. So we can look, for example, at the differences where we could regress characteristics on what somebody is paid, but control for variables like experience, and then look at what's left over and determine whether there's a significant difference after we account for the factors like experience, education, tenure in the organization, and so forth. This concludes our long unit on job analysis, and next in Module 4, we will move on to discuss the criterion problem. Thank you.